This time, we will read the names of the 142 Oregonian service members who gave their lives during Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. The names today will be read by Dean Chambers, an Air Force veteran and president of Salem's Team Red, White, and Blue chapter, Liz Estabrooks, Army veteran and currently the Women's Veterans Coordinator for Oregon Department of Veterans Affairs, Mr. Jerry Howard, Air Force veteran and currently a senior marketing executive for Volcanoes Baseball. And last, Mariah Williams, Army veteran and working for our agency in our conservatorship program. So I'd like to call up Mr. Chambers to read the names first.
Brian P. Bertrand, Lance Corporal, U.S. Marine Corps. Brandon S. Tobler, Specialist, U.S. Army. Frederick E. Picorni, Jr., First Lieutenant, U.S. Marine Corps. Donald R. Walters, Sergeant, U.S. Army. Gregory L. Stone, Major, U.S. Air Force. Aaron J. Contreras, Captain, U.S. Marine Corps. Robert A. Stever, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army. Joshua D. McIntosh, Corpsman, U.S. Navy. Travis J. Bradnack-Nall, Corporal, U.S. Marine Corps. Christopher R. Willoughby, Sergeant First Class, U.S. Army. David S. Perry, Staff Sergeant, Oregon Army National Guard. Eric C. Kesterson, Warrant Officer 1, U.S. Army. Joseph M. Lickenstaff, Specialist, U.S. Army. Christopher J. R. Wesley, Specialist, U.S. Army. Nathan W. Nakis, Specialist, Oregon Army National Guard. Eric F. Cook, Command Sergeant Major, U.S. Army. Travis A. Moodhart, Sergeant, U.S. Army. William C. Ramirez, Private First Class, U.S. Army. Philip G. Rogers, Specialist, U.S. Army. Gary F. Van Leuven, Lance Corporal, U.S. Marine Corps. Chase R. Whittam, Specialist, U.S. Army. Bob W. Roberts, Lance Corporal, U.S. Marine Corps. Joseph A. Jeffries, Specialist, U.S. Army. Justin L. Irely, Sergeant, U.S. Oregon Army National Guard. Justin W. Linden, Specialist, Oregon Army National Guard. Eric S. McCrae, First Lieutenant, Oregon Army National Guard. Eric S. McKinley, Specialist, Oregon Army National Guard. James B. Houston, Jr., Lance Corporal, U.S. Marine Corps. Brian P. Kelly, Lance Corporal, U.S. Marine Corps. Ken W. Lyston, Specialist, Oregon Army National Guard. Benjamin W. Eisenberg, Sergeant, Oregon Army National Guard. David J. Weisenberg, Staff Sergeant, Oregon Army National Guard. Aaron R. Boyles, Lance Corporal, U.S. Marine Corps. David W. Johnson, Sergeant, Oregon Army National Guard. Jeremy E. Christensen, Specialist, U.S. Army. David A. Mitz, Sergeant, U.S. Army.
Edwin W. Roodhouse, Specialist, U.S. Army. Damian T. Fisek, Sergeant, Oregon Army National Guard. Nano K. Ho, First Lieutenant, U.S. Army. James L. Moore, Corporal, U.S. Marine Corps. Mark C. Warren, Sergeant First Class, Oregon Army National Guard. Adam J. Plumendor, Sergeant, U.S. Army. Kevin D. Davis, Staff Sergeant, Oregon Army National Guard. Stephen W. Thornton, Major, U.S. Army. Kevin S. K. Wessel, Specialist, U.S. Army. Aaron A. Kent, Petty Officer 3rd Class, U.S. Navy. Ricky W. Rockholt, Jr., Specialist, U.S. Army. Jacob M. Simpson, Sergeant, U.S. Army. John B. Ogburn III, Staff Sergeant, Oregon Army National Guard. Jeffrey A. Lucas, Petty Officer 1st Class, U.S. Navy. Tane T. Baum, Staff Sergeant, Oregon Army National Guard. Adrian B. Stump, Warrant Officer 1, Oregon Army National Guard. Vernon R. Widner, Specialist, U.S. Army. Tyler J. Trier, Lance Corporal, U.S. Marine Corps. William B. Mewson, Sergeant, U.S. Army. John M. Holmason, Lance Corporal, U.S. Marine Corps. Michael S. Zyla, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army. Ryan D. Walker, Specialist, U.S. Army. Marks J. Nettles, Petty Officer 3rd Class, U.S. Navy. Jeremy M. Lovelace, Corporal, U.S. Army. Robert L. Jones, Specialist, U.S. Army. Christopher T. Pate, Captain, U.S. Marine Corps. Mark A. Lee, Petty Officer 2nd Class, U.S. Navy. Joseph R. Lake, Private, U.S. Army. Randy L. Newman, Lance Corporal, U.S. Marine Corps. Richard J. Hincus II, Sergeant 1st Class, U.S. Army. Robert J. Hall, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army. Nathaniel B. Lindsay, Sergeant, Oregon Army National Guard. Chase A. Haig, Sergeant, U.S. Army.
Dean R. Bright, Private First Class, United States Army. Derek W. Jones, Lance Corporal, United States Marine Corps. Douglas C. Desjardins, Specialist, United States Army. Billy B. Ferris, Corporal, United States Army. Brennan C. Gibson, Sergeant, United States Army. Sean P. Finnerty, Sergeant, United States Army. Ryan J. Hill, Private First Class, United States Army. Brian A. Browning, Specialist, United States Army. Long N. Wynn, Sergeant, Oregon Army, National Guard. Nathaniel D. Windsor, Lance Corporal, United States Marine Corps. John S. Stevens, Sergeant First Class, United States Army. Nicholas J. Leitner, Sergeant, United States Army. Brett A. Walton, Private First Class, United States Army. Michael L. Vaughn, Sergeant, United States Army. Dale G. Peterson, Lance Corporal, United States Marine Corps. Michael S. Barnhill, First Sergeant, United States Marine Corps. David G. Reese, Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps. Christopher D. Henderson, Sergeant, First Class, United States Army. Dominic N. Rodriguez, Specialist, United States Army. Joseph P. Kinney, Specialist, United States Army. Juan M. Garcia Schill, Lance Corporal, United States Marine Corps. Michelle R. Ring, Corporal, United States Army. Stephen A. Stacy, Lance Corporal, United States Marine Corps. Corey D. Weens, Corporal, United States Army. Daniel A. Leckel, Specialist, United States Army. Adrian M. Elizalde, Specialist, United States Army. Drew N. Jensen, Captain, United States Army. Graham M. McMahon, Corporal, United States Army. Joshua C. Brennan, Sergeant, United States Army. Zachary W. McBride, Sergeant, United States Army. Michael W. Miller, Sergeant, United States Army. Joshua A. R. Young, Private First Class, United States Army. Dustin L. Canham, Lance Corporal, United States Marine Corps. Jessica A. Ellis, Corporal, United States Army. James M. Trieber, Sergeant, United States Army. Tan Q. No, Private First Class, United States Army.
James L. Wiley, Jr., Lieutenant Colonel, Oregon Army National Guard. Bruno G. De Solini, Captain, Oregon Army National Guard. Cody J. Eggleston, Private First Class, U.S. Army. Robert L. Johnson, Lance Corporal, U.S. Marine Corps. Joshua M. Tillery, Chief Warrant Officer 2, U.S. Army. Richard A. DeWater, Private First Class, U.S. Army. Taylor D. Marks, Specialist, Oregon Army National Guard. Earl D. Warner, Sergeant, Oregon Army National Guard. Matthew R. Lemke, Corporal, U.S. Marine Corps. Michael E. Johnson, First Lieutenant, U.S. Marine Corps. Jason A. Schaefer, Sergeant, U.S. Army. David M. Mudge, Petty Officer 3rd Class, U.S. Navy. Elijah J. Rayo, Sergeant, U.S. Army. Joshua A. Langsdorff, Sergeant, U.S. Army. Aaron L. McLyman, Private First Class, U.S. Army. Dale A. Getz, Chaplain, Captain, U.S. Army. Anthony T. Justinson, Private First Class, U.S. Army. Joseph E. Rodwald, Lance Corporal, U.S. Marine Corps. Ian M. Tawney, Sergeant, U.S. Marine Corps. Matthew J. DeYoung, Sergeant, U.S. Marine Corps. Andrew E. Lara, Specialist, Oregon Army National Guard. Bryce M. Scott, Private First Class, U.S. Army. Riley Gallinger Long, Corpsman, U.S. Navy. Daniel R. Adams, Master Sergeant, U.S. Army. Adam J. Bies, Corporal, U.S. Marine Corps. Justin J. Wilkins, First Lieutenant, U.S. Air Force. Keaton G. Coffey, Corporal, U.S. Marine Corps. Andrew J. Keller, Private First Class, U.S. Army. Maubrey J. Anders, Specialist, U.S. Army. James D. Neal, Captain, U.S. Army. Brandon J. Prescott, Specialist, U.S. Army. Nicholas S. Welch, Specialist, U.S. Army. Jonathan S. Gibson, Chief Warrant Officer 3, U.S. Navy. Cody J. Patterson, Private First Class, U.S. Army. John A. Pelham, Specialist, U.S. Army.
At this time, I would like to ask Sergeant First Class Retired Montez and State Representative Paul Evans, Air Force veteran, to place the wreath in honor of the men and women whose names are inscribed on this memorial and all of our nation's fallen. Please join me in a moment of silence as the wreath is laid.